I hope you had a large breakfast, because this is definitely going to run over time. You know, when I had the privilege to be invited here, I thought I was going to be speaking to about 40 people for about half an hour. It seems I've got 15 minutes. And I've also forgotten everything I was going to say, because I think Carol covered absolutely everything, and I was getting angry with her. So it's very impassioned. I'm glad I don't work in Northern Ireland, because I think my blood pressure would go through the roof, because some of the problems that you've got, I think we've just managed to address them in Scotland. I think the best thing for me to do is just run through this slideshow that I've got as quickly as I possibly can, really, because there's loads of slides, to give you an impression of the kind of work that we do in Glasgow and the Gorbals. And it's very much taken from the point of view of what community-controlled housing associations have done. I don't know how many of you have any community-controlled associations in Northern Ireland, but vast majority of regeneration work in Glasgow and the west of Scotland has been done by community-controlled housing associations like yourselves. So first of all, the best thing to do is give you a bit of context to the work that we do, and a bit of context about what's in history of what's happening in Glasgow and the Gorbals. I know, as I say, I'll rush through this, because you know, unless you've had a huge breakfast, you're going to be absolutely starving, and you're going to want out of here after I ask a few questions. First thing I always show people this map down here is a map of Glasgow produced in 1982, showing you the poorest areas in Glasgow in the early 1980s, and they are precisely the areas that received all of the major investment between 1957 and 1974 through the local authority building programme in Glasgow. Glasgow had 220,000 social housing units, council houses, and they were, by their own admission, the biggest slum landlord in Europe. That was the position of Glasgow in 1980. In terms of the Gorbals, you can see there the old tenements coming down, Queen Elizabeth Square going up. The Gorbals got what was called the first comprehensive development area, which really meant that they trashed the entire area and built buildings that nobody really wanted. And they did that in 1965, and believe it or not, they were still doing it. They built this in 1974. I remember I was 14, I remember it going up, and I couldn't believe, even at the age of 14, that they were still building high-rises in Glasgow. They'd been such a comprehensive failure. Roughly, just a few years after your Northern Ireland Housing Executive was set up, I think in 71 or 72, things changed quite radically in Glasgow, because we ran out of money, and they set up community-controlled housing associations. And I'll very quickly take you through the history of them. These are some of the image of the work we've done. That's some work in the Gorbals and all around the city. They were, first of all, what had happened was they were left with a lot of tenements. They didn't know what to do with them. They'd run out of money. They couldn't do any more comprehensive development areas. And so they gave short-term cash. Glasgow led the initiative by getting money to housing associations through, of all things, the cleansing department. They were pretty imaginative in those days. And they set up some pilot projects, and it resulted in a tenemental rehabilitation programme through the 1970s into the 80s, which produced about 10,000 houses and really transformed perceptions of Glasgow across the UK in terms of all the stone cleaning. These were tenements where the first bathrooms that were put into tenements in Govan produced queues of people to come and look at a coloured bathroom suite in a tenement. And it was exciting times. Produced about 10,000 houses then. That's a picture of a well-known estate in Glasgow, Castlemilk, in the 1980s. Again, we moved into the outer estates, and community-controlled housing associations did a lot of remodelling work and a lot of new build. And again, a further 10,000 houses or so were added to the community-controlled housing association portfolio. The 1990s were very much about receiving stock transfers from the Scottish Special Housing Association, which had become Scottish Homes, which is similar to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, which the government demanded be split up. 17,000 houses were transferred to a variety of housing associations, including ourselves, and some of them created new housing associations which were debt funded. Some of them came to existing housing associations, and there was a lot of regeneration work associated with them. That put the stock amount up to around 40,000 or so. During the 2000s, we continued regeneration and new build, particularly with the GHA stock transfer coming up. Glasgow was short of around 13,000 houses or so. And in 2010s, the big picture has really been the transfer of 19,000 GHA homes to 20 community-controlled housing associations, to over 20. Now, those ballots, I mean, what the plan behind the GHA was, which is, you know, really been the creator of the Wheatley Group. Seems to me they may be coming to get you, so Derry's walls perhaps should be strengthened somewhat. I don't know if they will come. The situation there was that in the context of these ballots, the tenant majority for the support for transfer was over 90%. So that reflects the reputation which community control had in Glasgow. So the idea, and it has been put around now, that it's transferred to local organisations ran out of steam. It's absolutely not true. There was a change of direction. We are where we are, but there is massive support for it then, and there remains massive support for it now. Housing associations have, from the very beginning, been involved in social and economic regeneration, including workspaces in particular. That's one in Castlemilk. That's actually won an RIBA award. It's the last old building in Castlemilk. And we've been involved in the development of sports activities, job creation in terms of environmental improvements. We don't promote drug abuse. We try to diminish the effects of drug abuse. And then you do the usual work with the elderly and provide community facilities. So that kind of wider action agenda has always been part and parcel of what we do. A huge issue for me personally and for a lot of associations is a complete and utter commitment to design quality. And we heard a lot of things said about procurement this morning. You get this situation where people start thinking things like procurement are rocket science. They're not. They're straightforward. You've just got to do it really, really well. There's a huge, huge responsibility on anybody who's got to do procurement, because you're putting up buildings that will last for 60 to 100 years. So you've got to get everything done as well as possible. And these are excellent examples from Reid Vale Housing Association in the East End of Glasgow, who also have developed community facilities alongside that in their office. And as Carol was saying earlier on, it's really important to have a more holistic approach and not simply build housing. It is mostly, at the end of the day, about bricks and mortar. You know, it's not, bricks and mortar are the key thing. It's what you do with them. And if you don't put the investment in up front, and the thought in up front, and the design in up front, you'll waste money, because that has been the lesson that was learned in the 1960s in the Gorbals, which we'll go on to. The common thread amongst all that is empowered communities. Glasgow's got over 50 community-controlled housing associations. We own collectively over 60,000 homes. We're controlled by over 1,000 volunteers who make up our management boards. I am employed by a board of, fundamentally, they're all tenants and a couple of owners, and they're elected on an annual basis. They are my employer. They're local, responsive and accountable. We have to care. We've got nowhere to go. Our office is like a corner shop. People can get to me immediately. There's nowhere to run. If we don't do our job properly, we'll get found out really quickly and punished for it. We're here to stay. We're a flexible community resource, so we're able to respond to challenges as they emerge and as things change. And at the end of the day, we've got a raison d'etre. We have a reason to exist. It's to serve the communities we're rooted in. A big worry that I have about housing associations, it's all very well to have aims and objectives, but unless you have got direct accountability, frankly, a lot of that stuff's just platitudes. It can change overnight because a lot of boards are simply self-perpetuating. Where you've got a direct link, constitutional link to local governance frameworks and a local democracy, then you have genuine accountability and a reason to continue to care. The Gorbals, which has got extremely strong, a lot of you know, have got extremely strong connections with Ireland, some in Derry, but particularly Donegal. It's in the middle of Glasgow, just that's at the cross of the river and the M8. And there are three main areas: Lauriston, Hutchinson Town and Oatlands. It's the Hutchinson Town area in Gorbals which has had the most money spent on it, which is where our offices are based, which is where most of the regeneration activity is. The history of the Gorbals is an absolutely fascinating one. This is it in probably the mid-19th century, where it was a village. Gorbals has a sort of love-hate relationship with Glasgow because it's located just to the south of the city centre. The River Clyde used to be able to be forded, so all your sort of cowboy types, if you like, used to live in the Gorbals and basically take all of their contraband and sell it in the early morning in Glasgow and then beat it back over the river before the authorities could catch them. So it was real cowboy territory. Some people would argue that that hasn't changed. And the punishment that Glasgow got was when Glasgow had to set up a leper colony in 1470. Guess where they located it? The Gorbals. And there's been a kind of tension between Gorbals and the city ever since. It became the huge receiving point for immigration, particularly Irish immigration. These tenements here would have housed 95% Irish. 90,000 people came from Ireland and landed in the Brumallow. 20,000 Eastern European Jews came from Lithuania, and 20,000 came from what they call the Second Highland clearances. So it was a completely new community. They did, in their day, build middle-class tenements, and these proved to be the worst slums of all, because the whole regeneration fell apart because it's really towards the east of the city. All of the pollution was driven downwind. People believed typhoid and cholera was carried in the wind, so everybody fled west. This area here, which was Lauriston, the middle classes fled, and these properties here some of these houses ended up housing up to 40 individuals. You can see photographs of things that people think are actually the number of the flat, and it's got the number 40 or 42 on it. That was the maximum occupancy. So the conditions in these properties were the worst ever. Moving on, that's what Gorbals looked like. Just basically in the 1960s, it had become completely decimated, but these are pictures of it from the 1950s and the 1930s. This is probably about the 1950s. The Gorbals was the most densely populated area in Northern Europe with the exception of Naples. It housed 130,000 people. It would have been the 5th largest city in Scotland if it was declared a city in its own right. And when the 1960s came, really the plans that they had were atrocious. Those were the days when the vision was everybody would have a car and live in a filing cabinet. That is not, as you'll see, we had a high-powered committee even then. This is, you'll recognise the Queen. Remembering, if you're as old as I am or older, you'll remember the Queen was actually quite a glamorous figure in the 1960s. Maybe not well received everywhere, but this was one of her first trips out, and she came to the Gorbals, and that was Archibald Dury, the city engineer. These hands definitely throttled a lot of people because they controlled absolutely everything. They were driving these kind of plans forward. This was one of 13 arbitrary plans where they just flung old shoe boxes and turned them up and said, yeah, we'll have some of that shit. And it just looks absolutely terrible. Terrible place to live, no thought given to the ground level experience and what kind of place they were creating. And even when they were thinking about the Gorbals is split by roads and railways coming from the city centre, they thought, no, that's not enough, give it another one, build a motorway across it, trash the community, What do these people deserve? They're just a leper colony. That's really the view. And then they just built it. Then they actually did it. That's as good as it got, Queen Elizabeth Square. The architect, Sir Basil Spence, said that he thought that it would look like Spanish galleons sailing into the sunset when people put their washing out in the balcony. Right? I've got an inclination towards Tourette's, so I've really got to watch what I say here. The wind speeds at the legs below reached 130 miles an hour. Trams were getting blown to Bridgeton. Washing was ending up in the Carlton and in Edinburgh, right? That's me at the age of 6 going, Jesus, what's going on? They're building this shit. And people embraced modernism. As this was going up, people knew where they were going to be. I'm going to be on the 8th floor. This is brilliant. They embraced modernism. They saved up for their sofas and their settee. A lot of people argue that, the people just weren't up to modernism. Modernism let them down. In fact, it was bad modernism. You look at this. This is Hutchie. Hutchie was only up for 12 years before it was demolished. It was called the Dampies. It was absolutely grim. That's as good as it got. It looks like a prison. When I was a kid, I thought they were building a prison. And it's just, by the 1980s, it was just a sprawl of rubbish. That's what it was. And that's when I started working there in 1990. Queen Elizabeth Square, you're supposed to blow buildings down. This was actually advertised as the biggest explosion since the Second World War, and they blew it up, right? Went everywhere. The wife of one of our committee was actually killed that day by flying debris. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. The Dampies, where our offices are now situated, was actually demolished. That's probably white asbestos dust, because they didn't do an asbestos strip beforehand. That wasn't there, thank God. That was developed, and it was only occupied for 11 years. It wasn't even fully occupied, but the walls were streaming with water from day one. Those were the days in Harold Wilson saying, looking forward to the white heat of technology and all this. So my dad used to sell wallpaper, and he was a sort of decorator's rep. I remember 2 jobs that he had. One, he gets sued for selling wallpaper and paint to the Gilbert Ash who built that because none of it would stick to the walls like it was his fault. And at the other end of the thing, he provided the gold leaf for the QE2, and you can imagine which side trip I enjoyed the most. That's looking at the Gorbals. And then at the end of the 1980s, you could see 3 distinct areas. The Crown Street Regeneration area was declared a regeneration area, and that was where a huge focus for investment is going to be. A couple of other areas, Queen Elizabeth Square, where that was, and the Gorbals East area, which is where we ended up working. Moving through, it was a huge, high-profile thing, the Crown Street Regeneration project, and it was on the site of those Dampies, Hutchie as it was called. And it was set up on the basis, it was a London architect, Piers Goff, won the master plan. It was being driven by the then Glasgow Development Agency at a very, very high profile level because, frankly, Stuart Gulliver was the chief executive. He'd been in Berlin, seen all of the cranes, seen all of the building work and thought, right, we need to do housing-led regeneration. They're not paying any attention to the fact that the agency he was leading wasn't supposed to touch housing with a barge pole. That didn't matter to him. He went ahead and did it, and we ended up with this situation here. And what this structure doesn't show you is that, yeah, I went along on behalf of New Gorbals Housing Association. It had community members, 4 community members from the start, even though it was fundamentally a private sector scheme, only 20% rented housing. My first meeting that I went, the chief executive of the council was there, the director of planning was there, the director of housing was there, the director of architecture was there, the director of roads was there. If you put a planning application in from Crown Street, you didn't have any trouble whatsoever. Everything just sailed through because there was a high level focus on what should happen. And there was only one project director who was the project champion, and it worked really well. There was what was planned at the time, 1,000 new houses, new business centre, a library, new local shopping centre, a hotel. What you got to remember, in 1988, if you'd said we're going to build a hotel in the Gorbals, right, frankly, somebody would have come round with a really large syringe, whacked it into your bum, knocked you out, put you in a jacket with no arms in it, and put you into a car that had flashing blue lights and said, cheerio, see you again, never, right? And it's happened, and it's full, 90% occupancy rate. It's stunning, right? And it's great. I can't take credit for that because that was other people involved in it. And that was a bit of a Danny Kaye vision, but that was like what was supposed to happen. Crown Street, that was the catalytic scheme which everything flowed from. They took care of long-term management issues and the housing associations involved in, factoring, and they've set up a trust company that helps the area come on. Everything was predicated on the powers which flow from what we call in Scotland the few disposition, which gives the factor great control. And the first act of the new Scottish Parliament in 1999 was to abolish few superior powers, so it left us with nothing. But by that, we found ways through that, and certainly we act on behalf of the community in the Gorbals beyond simply being a landlord in Crown Street. These are some of the images of that. This is an angel. This is known as the Angel of the Gorbals. And after 8 years after it was built, it's huge, a huge, huge hanging structure. Water had collected in it, and as you know, it's inside of it, it's iron, I suppose. And the red iron started coming out of the hands of the angel, and people actually thought it was a miracle. You know, the church did get involved, and I remember thinking, geez, I don't believe this one. So, no, it's just iron, promise you, right? And it was in the papers and everything. It was great. So, welcome to the Gorbals, the miracle in the Gorbals. And this is the sort of stuff about. That was one of the associations building. That was almost not the only building, but hugely responsible for Glasgow getting the UK City of Architecture in 1999. I know that because Sir Terence Conran told me when they came round. And our committee, all the staff stood by our committee, showed him and persuaded him why they chose that. That's our offices. If you ever visit the Gorbals, all the ones with design plaques, they're not private sector, they're the Housing Association, right? Just so you know that. That's a corner shop, that's what we want to be. We want to be accessible. And any old buildings that we've got, we've tried to keep. And we created a high street. You know, we've recreated a high street at a time when all the other places are creating their out-of-town shopping centres. And we've gone from dereliction to the Danny Kaye vision to actually being done. But there's been more. That's Crown Street, there's the Scottish Homes Estate, which we've taken over. There's the Gorbals East area, which we started on first. And in the Gorbals East area, we built a quieter type, but frankly, I think a far higher design quality of architecture. In which context, we've got care units. That's an 8-bed space care unit for dementia sufferers. A whole mix of housing and shared ownership. And the very first schemes that we did, and Sheila Hannon's here from now working in Belfast, and she was one of the development officers before I started moving that stuff forward. And she was invited to that opening, so Sheila takes a lot of credit for this stuff as well, certainly in terms of starting it off. And we were doing a scheme there which was 70 houses, but we used 3 different architects because we wanted to create something special. We wanted to create an impact. We wanted to, in the parlance of the time, reverse negative perceptions and make a splash, and we did. And it was fantastic, and the Gorbals Arts Project got involved doing stone mosaic stuff. And these here, these are not pineapples, they are not grenades, they are Scots fir pine cones, but we got money from Europe for them because they are vertical traffic calming features, right? So there's all sorts of imaginative ways of getting money. Too many multi-stories in the Gorbals, so We took some out. There is nothing, people say, oh, smaller organisations, they don't have the capacity to do good development work. There is nothing that we haven't done. There isn't an award that we haven't won. There isn't a smile that we haven't put in somebody's face that's gone round our area and say, wow, what a place you've created. You don't have to be big to do it really well. And we've had the plaudits. We finished the Hutchison Town area. We completed the demolition. We did a full-scale modernisation of all of the homes. I'll show you a bit more of the external works earlier on, but we did that with the residents there. And again, another huge challenge that we had was in the site that was left by the demolished multi-stories. We kept 2 of them. On this site here, it was a massive design challenge in terms of making certain it's got to relate to the school, it's got to relate to the old church. The new build down there, so it's a huge, huge challenge. My committee loved that when they saw it. They went, what? Well, man, do that again, you know. In the old days, they used to have drawings for ages. This is it. I mean, I don't know. You could possibly live in that, you know. Eventually, they had all sorts of options. We had a master planner, and again, we went to 2 separate architects to have a sense of variety, visual variety in it. And sure, we created something special, and we're very, very proud of that work. But you really got to care about what you're doing all the time, and it's a huge responsibility. And by the way, 45% grant levels don't work. Anyway, moving on. We've just negotiated them back up to 60% in Scotland. I was on the team, Susan Torrance from the SFHA, so hired hands were available. And this is how the new build and the modernised stuff. I hate saying this, we've really, really gone out of our way to make this stuff look European as opposed to somebody just spat render at it and made it a Battenberg cake, which is, I know an organisation that does that quite a lot in Glasgow. So here's been our main roles. We've been the partners in Crown Street, and we've been involved in the procurement. We factor, that means we're the landlord to the private sector, and we run the trust. For a joint approach in Queen Elizabeth Square, and we led in Gorbals East. So we had a huge responsibility. But beyond that, we've got involved in wider action. So that's the credit union down there. We built the credit union. We got all the grant funding for them. We're involved in supporting money and legal advice. We've got our own welfare rights worker. That's not uncommon. We support the local arts project, who did the pine cones, cum grenades, and various other things. And we do, through community benefit, European legislation, support employment schemes and tenancy support, youth project support, and we also support childcare schemes. But it's bitty, and I'll come back to that later on. Good management and maintenance, that should actually be up in huge capital letters in its own slide, because you've got to do the management and maintenance as well as you do the building. And I have to say, unless you set aside enough funds to do that properly, you're just going to end up in the same shit as you were in the 1960s, because you're not looking after your stock. People who run community-controlled housing associations in Glasgow will not give in to grant rates that are not sustainable, because they come from a background where their housing became untenable and had to be demolished simply because there wasn't the money to look after it properly. The physical result has been that we've got 1,000 new build, 200 are on site, 650 Scottish home stock transfer, 920 GHA, so we've got 2,600 roughly units. On the private side of things, there's been about 1,400 new build, 500 or so ex-right to buy, so there's around 2,000 units there. But the 4,500 units, and that will, in the fullness of time, go up to 6,000 units, because we've got to go on, move on to Lauriston. And that's, from my point of view, it's been driven by local community ownership and accountability, a huge focus, commitment and passion, which I have to say, having heard Carol, is not exclusive to the community-controlled movement, but it is certainly built in more. A real sense of community and local history, and the big word, caring. You've got to care about everything that you do at every stage. And all of the things which have been getting in the way in terms of land ownership and financial commitment, Project Champion, there have been Express Council support, commitment to a planning process and quality from all partners, and a determination to see a community that was mixed tenure and mixed use. That's been built in from the start, and that commitment's been expressed by all parties, so that's made it very easy for us. And by 2009, that's what we had. This is where Queen Elizabeth Square was, in the middle. It's all come together. There are now beautiful streets to work through. The architects worked very closely. It's better that it wasn't a single master plan. And if you go around all of this, you're looking at hotel. This has been demolished. It's going to be a new health centre and our new offices. That's City Tech, who is the 46th biggest medium enterprise at £650 million turnover a year. Community centre in the old St Francis Church. Sports centre, employment centre, industrial units. It's littered with mixed use across the Gorbals, which makes it a far more interesting, varied and sustainable place to live in. The Citizens Theatre, which you may have heard of, is just over here. I'm going to just go through it. Actually, I'll put that face down. That was silly. Right, okay, I'll give you 2 more minutes. I'll finish up. And moving on to Lauriston, it's just like, is it just the same again, right? I won't do this in detail. Yes, it is. Master plan, same process, going through it, and it's going really, really well. This is the stuff that's on site. It's got a private sector lead. We've learned from some mistakes, and so far, so good. Just trust me, Lauriston will be okay because we care. And if you want to see it, you're welcome to come and visit. However, the Gorbals now, even looking at all of that, has still got the third worst child poverty rate in Glasgow. And I thought I'd compare it to Northern Ireland. So the Gorbals is at 51%. Glasgow, which is a relatively poor city, is at 34%. And Scotland's at 19%. Where we are today is a sort of mirror image of that. Northern Ireland, 21% child poverty, very close to Scotland. Derry, 35%, very close to Glasgow. Brandywell, I like the name, sounds like the kind of place I could stay. 61%, but still, I mean, Glasgow's worst is 58, incidentally. But the Gorbals, despite all that regeneration that you've seen and the introduction of mixed tenure, is still poor. And we've got the lowest life male expectancy in Glasgow, 63 years. And we're world class at the second highest rate of alcohol-related discharges in Glasgow, which is the gold standard measure. You know, I'm pretty sure, I mean, there must be something in the name. I think Brandywell, there's something in that name. I think they might be able to beat us there too, but we'll see. We were the 11th most deprived neighbourhood in Glasgow in 2012, but we were the 5th worst in 2004, so things have improved. And we're probably, so a lot of these figures come from 2010-11, I think things have actually improved still. But in that context, we've actually, you know, had to look at what we're doing. So fuel poverty is massive, so we've prioritised that through eco-programmes, and every spare penny that we've got from any avenue, we're putting into alleviating fuel poverty in a whole host of different ways. We commissioned a neighbourhood audit that found all of that because we want to be able to target our resources in relation to wider action and social and economic activity far better. And we're now expressly committed to tackling social and economic regeneration problems in the same way as we are to good maintenance and management, because we're now big enough to do that. It's not just an add-on. We've done quite a lot. It's now going to become a core part of our business. So we've assumed the role of community anchor, and that's in the context of Glasgow City Council have now got, through their single outcome agreement, a commitment to what are called thriving places. They've called all these places thriving places because they're not, right? You know, so it makes it really difficult to talk about them. The Gorbals is a thriving place, but it isn't, right? So anyway, the way in which what they are saying is that the community's priorities there will be taken account of. There'll be community empowerment, influence, capacity building, their aspirations will be met, and they will be involved in co-production with other agencies. And that's a 10-year commitment. So that's an absolute huge step forward in terms of basically committing themselves to a community-focused, community-based approach. The initial steps that we'll go through, ownership and control, well, the Housing Association already provides control of all of the assets and ownership of all the housing, most of the housing assets. Participatory budgeting will be looked at, and consultation will be looking at open days workshops and a citizens panel. In terms of information, we've already got a decent infrastructure there through quarterly newsletters, but there'll be more public meetings, residents' conferences biannually, and we really have to look at using IT and social media to get young people involved. Engagement is really through tenants and residents groups, residents, tenants, organisations and community council, and the big part of it will be our collaboration and support of the local third sector organisation. Key will be early intervention and locally based service delivery. The Christie Commission in Scotland estimated that about 40% of public expenditure could be saved if we had a 10-year period during which money was spent on early intervention rather than try to fix it after the problem's established. It is a bit like, you know, they spend 95% of the health service resources on the last 3 months of your life and 2% in the first 2 years of your life. You know, maybe euthanasia would be quite a good idea for people like me in a couple of years' time. You know, you've got to start looking, we've got to look at how we spend our money, and early intervention is definitely a way to go. I wasn't serious about the euthanasia, by the way, in case, you know, sort of, it's not getting televised, is it? By the way, if anybody looks behind you, you're staring straight into full beam headlights. You really do feel like a rabbit in headlights. It knocks you off balance every now. Locally based, I'll give you one example of that before. For example, the local Play Barn, the Barn Youth Initiative, they're the only ones that have really got what they call in the parlance reds, ambers and reds, which are basically kids that will never work again. They're the only ones that can put their arm around them, take them, whether it's the Duke of Edinburgh Award schemes or various things, and support them through the programmes which they would otherwise fail on. So you can't just say, here's an 8-week training programme, they only show up on day one. You've got to have a whole wrap-round local service, people that understand them, people that trust them, that they trust, in order to get them through these things. It takes about a year to build their capacity, but you do end up getting there. Now, that's local service delivery, and that requires the money to go to local voluntary sector agencies and not go to some of the employment agencies in Glasgow. And we shouldn't forget that what we do in housing is actually the earliest possible intervention you can have in anybody's life, because that's what provides the foundation for kids to be brought up, for people to feel safe and secure, for them to have affordable homes, for them to have a great place to live. I mean, it's been said, and he's certainly not my hero, but he was right about some things. Winston Churchill said, I think, was that you build the buildings, you build the buildings, then the buildings will make you. So, and that's very, very true. And we shouldn't forget that, and you should never underestimate, ever, ever underestimate the effect that bricks and mortar properly done can have, because they actually do physically make the places. And after that, you've got to take every other challenge on, head on, one by one. In my view, community control, community ownership of assets is the way to go. The extent to which that could be applied in Northern Ireland or promoted in Northern Ireland, I don't know, but it's certainly worth looking at. Thank you.